Okay. Hey, everyone. This is the Polygonal Perspective podcast, and I'm Serge.
And I'm Ian.
Welcome. Now, Ian, why are we here?
Well, we wanted to do a show. We're both designers for Rebellion Developments, and we thought it'd be fun to play some games, get each other to play some games that one person is already quite well versed with, the other person is totally new to or relatively new to. The other person is going to try this game out for probably the first time, and then we're going to talk about it afterwards. And, hopefully you'll see what a designer's perspective on checking out new games is like.
That's right. First, we'll start with who we are and how we got here in terms of both our professional lives and personal lives that have to do with games and playing games. I'm especially interested in our early days. We both, Ian is about 10 years younger than I am, but we kind of ended up playing similar games as we grew up, but our experiences are pretty different. Ian is from Canada. I am from, I was born in USSR, currently Lithuania. So we grew up in different environments, and I think it's interesting to look back at our lives and see what led us to like games to begin with, to want to make them for this episode 0. So Ian, do you want to start with that?
So the first game I played was the original Tomb Raider on computer. I was 4 years old.
Wow, that's interesting. It's so different because I actually remember my first game as well, and I'll talk about it later, but it was a NES game called Adventure Island.
Oh yeah.
But a Tomb Raider is so much later than that.
Yeah. And even that game was, I guess it was a few years old when I first played it. But most people my age, half of them have started with like the GameCube. It's like a big jump. I feel like an old timer when I talk to half my friends about the kind of games that I played. For me, it was my cousin had it on his computer, my older cousin, and just being amazed that you press keys on the keyboard and this person on the screen does stuff. So my dad picked up, I think he picked up like a burned copy or something from his work, and set that up on our DOS machine, and that was great. And after picking up a bunch of the other Tomb Raider games, they all came with these IDOS demo discs. You could see trailers for like Deus Ex, Daikatana.
Okay.
You could play demos for like Thief the Dark Project. Check out footage for like Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. Weirdly enough, titles that a lot of them came back to have massive influences on my career later.
So how old were you then?
4 or 5 years old.
So what year was that?
99, 2000.
Right, okay, cool. So paint me the picture of those years in Canada, and how was it with getting games, getting consoles, buying them, playing them? What about your friends?
At that age, my friends didn't really have any video games. If they were into it, it's because I show them something and they get excited about it. A few years later, you go off to school and other kids have game consoles or whatever. For me, it was pretty much PC, and then I had a Game Boy. I had the original black and white brick Game Boy, and my dad's a big sports card collector, so we would go to flea markets and yard sales and things like that. And he'd look for sports cards, and if he found Game Boy games, he'd pick them up for me. So at the time, that original Game Boy came out in like 88, 89. Like the years that I was playing the Game Boy Color was out, right? But it was this feeling of like you could pick up these games just anywhere, and you didn't care at that age whether they were new or old. They were just cool new games, and I think to this day.
So was Game Boy your first console then?
Yeah, it was.
Right, okay. Did you ever have NES or SNES or Sega?
No, that came much later.
Right, okay. So then I guess you grew up in the 2000s, the noughties, they're called. By the time you finished school, what were you playing in terms of consoles and games and stuff like that?
School is in elementary?
Yeah, like the 12th grade, up to the 12th grade. Yeah.
So around 17 or so?
Yes.
17, I had an Xbox 360. I had a PC that like a decent PC where I was playing all the new games as they came out. But by that point, I was also getting into like quote unquote retro gaming. I suppose I never really left it. I got a 360 right around when I went into high school. So for years there, the new consoles were out, and I'm just a kid. I couldn't afford them. My parents were the kind of parents who were just going to like drop a big present on me like that, spend hundreds of dollars on a game console. So the feeling was, again, just keep going to flea markets and stuff, and people are just throwing away these Nintendo 64s and these Super Nintendo games and things like that. And I sort of got into the retro collecting early, so to speak, by in some ways just not caring whether it's a big budget release or whether it's some quirky old thing that nobody's ever heard of. It's always just a cool game is a cool game. A great game is a great game. You know, a lot of my favorite games are old ones for that reason, because I don't have much of a distinction between what's old and what's new, and what's cheap and what's expensive.
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in the 90s, post-Soviet Lithuania, post-Soviet any country had problems with just having things in general, and it was no different for games. Back then, it was so expensive everywhere, and no one had anything. So I remember there was these big malls, and each mall had maybe like one console that was really famous. You go to this mall that had like Sega Saturn, and you would go there and you check it out, but you would never buy it because no one ever had money, and it was so expensive. Or you would go to a different mall and you would have a Sega Dreamcast. So around that time, which was early to mid 90s, we started getting these knockoff consoles. Now, it only happened, I think, in Eastern Europe. That's why I was able to experience, and I think in UK as well a bit. Back then, there was the market, but it was a bit of a Wild West. So there was Nintendo, there was Sega, but also there was these opportunists, and apparently from Taiwan, mostly, who took these consoles like NES, SNES, and Sega, and just made copies of them. Mm-hmm. One of the more famous ones is the Scorpion 16, and in fact I was just reading or actually watching a video on YouTube. I'll link it in the show notes. This person did a deep dive on that subject, and apparently they were just being sold in UK in normal shops because no one really cared enough to like contest that. Yeah, there was no crackdown. You could see the cracked console and like the fake consoles in the shop next to the legitimate NES and SNES and Segas. Now, that wasn't even that where I grew up. Where I grew up, the parents of us kids would get a console, and we would go to a friend's place, and it would be like this thing that looks nothing like Sega, but it actually plays the Sega cartridges, and you would get these knockoffs of NES and SNES, and you would put a cartridge in, and those cartridges were also from probably China, and they were hacked as hell. You could get like a cartridge of Mario. It had all Mario levels. Each Mario would then be subdivided into each level of the Mario, and then you could play as a green Mario, as a blue Mario, as whatever Mario. You get all the power-ups, everything. It was not uncommon to have cartridges for like 100 games, for example. I'm not sure if like officially they supported multiple games in those. I know that by the time Sega came out, it was one game per cartridge, right? I don't think I've ever heard of multiple games per.
I had a 6-pack for Genesis. It's a collection of some of the earlier titles.
Okay, so there you have it.
It's pretty uncommon.
Right.
It's interesting though, because these days in North America, there's a fair amount of clone consoles that you can pick up, and there's a fair amount of these multi-carts that are pretty popular. But growing up, I never saw any of that unlicensed stuff.
Yeah, I don't think it actually penetrated past Central Europe and a bit of UK. It was a Wild West, and all of that was like unlicensed, illegal. That continued up until we got to the Sega Genesis, which was late 90s. Mm-hmm. So once that came out...
Genesis in the late 90s. So did you get it?
Mid to late 90s, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I got it then.
So it was years after it was already out in the other territories.
Yeah. And then it was mostly because it became more or less the same price as the knockoffs. Mm-hmm. So the knockoffs lost the market at that point. The market was going to fall anyway. They were going to be out of the market pretty soon. That whole period of time where you could get those knockoff consoles was the start of the 90s all the way to the late 90s. It really didn't get past the Sega Genesis too. So then I had Genesis, had a bunch of games for that, and then I remember I traded that for an NBA sticker album. To this day, I regret it so much. I just loved basketball back then. And this one kid just rolled in with his skateboard, and back then we were collecting these stickers. They look like Pokemon cards, I guess, but they're stickers, and you have an album and you stick them in there. And I was so jealous. I was looking at that album. I wanted so hard. And he's like, yeah, I'll trade it for something. I was like, okay, I'll have this console and a bunch of games. And he's like, yeah, I'll trade for that. So I gave him my Sega, and I had, I don't know, 30 games, 20 games. I don't remember, but it was a lot. To this day, I remember this. Yeah, so that was late 90s, and then soon afterwards, the console prices became a bit more acceptable, and I was able to get a PS1. But even then, you could get a console maybe because it was expensive, but you could at least justify that it's a console. But the games themselves remained so pricey. I remember going into a shop and they had a Final Fantasy X. So that was a bit later on when PS2 came out. They had Final Fantasy X, sealed new, I guess it was European PAL region. And it was, in today's money, it would have probably been like, let's say, I don't know, £300. Imagine going to like a shop today and looking at a PS5 game and it's £300. So that was the reality of it. And because of that, general piracy continued.
Mod shipping, yeah.
Yeah, well, yes. So it was really easy to get a mod chip PS1. And from then on, you would go to the bazaar, whatever, marketplace.
Yeah.
And there was a guy in a steel container-looking kiosk. You would go there and he had a book. You would flip through it and he had the games there. They would burn their own discs. They would print their own labels on discs as well. Sometimes they were so bad. Really horrible. They would put labels on them and you would buy them for, in today's money, for let's say £2. £2 a disc. You get the new game. So me and my friend, we were big gamers back then. Just play every day after school. So we would just go to these marketplaces every weekend, drive there, come back with like 10 games, right?
The burn thing, I don't remember like a market for that, but whenever I pick up a PS1 from a charity shop or something like that, there's probably like a 50% chance that it has some kind of mod chip in it. No matter whether I've looked at stuff in the UK or stuff in Canada, somebody's always got a chipped PS1. Somebody usually had a cousin or a friend that worked at a game store that knew a guy who could get you burned discs.
So did you ever get a chance to buy any actual burned PS1 games back then?
No, because at the time it was still just PC and game.
Right, okay.
I've been too young.
Yeah, so that continued to PS2 as well. You could get mod chip PS2s pretty easily as well. Same vein, really. You get the mod PS2 and then you get the burned discs. They didn't care, like they would just burn them. It was the same, CD-ROMs, right? Mm-hmm. So that was the time where I played a lot of games that made me want to make them as well. Think your Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy 7, Xenogears, the golden age of RPGs definitely was that time. And in a way, I guess I was lucky that I was able to do that through piracy, unfortunately, I guess. But, that was the reality of my time and my location.
If you want to talk about value for your money, you don't get much better than a 40, 60-hour JRPG for £2 or so.
Well, also, what they say is back then, us kids had a lot more time. And also, the games wouldn't come out as often. So you would get a game, you would spend like months playing it, right?
Yeah.
Not just getting 200 hours on it, but having months because there was nothing else. So yeah, I played, 7, 8, 9, 10, all of that stuff. Left a big impression on me. Going into PS2, 10, I really like 10. So for you, Ian, how did you end up deciding to make games yourself?
I don't think there was a time where I didn't want to do something like that. I think when I was a really young kid, my parents put a lot of restrictions on the amount of time that I could play video games. They were always threatening to throw these discs in the trash, right? But I was a big reader because that was my big thing aside from games. So when I was a kid, I thought I'd be a writer. But I would do stuff like, if I couldn't play a game, then I would like redesign it as like a board game, come up with some dice and draw it out on paper, and try to recreate some of the rules. It never really worked, but I didn't really know at the time that 9, 10, 11 years old that I was kind of doing game design. I remember playing D&D and thinking, wow, this is just like all these RPGs that I'm playing on PC, like Morrowind and stuff like that, but in a board game. Always had a hard time trying to find other people to play these games with, but even just that solo act of making up stuff, it kind of naturally led into these things. And you read articles and you find out there are people that do this stuff, and I kind of assumed I'd have to move to like California to make this kind of thing work, because everybody's in California, at least it seemed at the time. Canada had BioWare way out in Edmonton, practically on the other side of the world. There's Silicon Knights in St. Catharines, which is a few hours away, I suppose. But I always just assumed that I was going to go to California, work for a big big company like Sony or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. Studios like BioWare was big back then.
Yeah.
You think Baldur's Gate, you definitely had options. I also knew that I wanted to make games pretty early on, from the moment I played my first game, which was Adventure Island. By the way, that game, it's actually amazing that I remember it because I played it very early. I was maybe like 6 or 7. I remember it was so hard. I've never actually beaten that. It's like a side scroller made by Hudson. I think there's 3 of them. Played 1 and 2. It was really hard. It's obvious Mario clones back then. Who wouldn't do a Mario clone? This middle-aged, overweight guy that throws axes at dinosaurs and then jumps on a skateboard to avoid rocks. It was so hard. But yeah, that was the first game. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, wow, that is amazing. I can't believe I'm controlling this small guy and I can make him do all these amazing things with a controller.
Yeah.
That kind of stayed with me. And from then that I want to do that. But growing up in Lithuania, there was no apparent path for me to take. I was finishing school, and by chance, a uni from England came over, and they were recruiting young people to kind of join the uni. And they had a game development course. I jumped on the opportunity, did the tests, did well, joined the uni, and came over in 2004, straight after school. But even then, it was really early days. Even in UK, people didn't know how to teach the game development. I actually think that's a problem nowadays still to this day. Yeah, to this day, it's a problem.
Schools.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's still a problem. But after that, I got headhunted by Rockstar to work in localization QA. Did that for 8 years. Worked on most of the titles that Rockstar did. Everything from GTA 3 to Manhunt to Bully, all the way up to Red Dead 2. Eventually wanted to do more. Left Rockstar, joined Rebellion, and soon joined the design team. And currently, we shipped Sniper Elite 5, actually.
Yeah, we were both level designers on that.
Yeah, as of this recording, we're working on an unannounced title. So tell me about the... I know you worked on a bunch of indie projects. Tell me about them a bit.
So similar to you, I spoke to, I think, like a guidance counselor back in high school. Like, how do I make this career path work? They didn't really give me any clear answers. Now, I knew somebody who was making games in their spare time. They went to an arts college and did a game development program. My parents, I think, wanted me to do something a little more general. You know, if this video game fad doesn't pan out, then at least Ian can go back to computer programming or IT. I think that's what they wanted me to do, something with computer science, because my math grades were pretty good. And I was doing a lot of programming, had turned into one of these hobbies, mostly because it was a way of making games, you know. So I went to a university for that. Kind of turned into an arts degree when it was clear I wasn't actually very good at math. Nonetheless, I worked as a programmer for a little while for the government and some other minor gigs, trying to figure out how to make this thing work. In my spare time, I'm making all these games, all these little mod projects and things like that. One of the best ways that I would say people can get into the industry is by looking for positions at indie companies. There's a lot of little indie companies full of young 20-somethings who are, they don't have any experience. And so they're looking at people who have about the same level of experience as them. And you get the chance to dabble in a lot of little projects, just little contract work for a few months at a time, which I found to be great because I got to try some different games in different size teams with some different people. And it wasn't glamorous, but with that stuff, I was able to, move up and get a job here at Rebellion. I wanted to move. I wanted a chance to see the world a bit. So I moved over to the UK, came over here to work as a designer on the Sniper Elite games. I should add as well that before I did the design contracting, I was also QA on this game Spider Right of the Shredded Moon, which, funny enough, was working with some of the people who had worked on some games like Deus Ex and Thief, bringing it back to those demos in that IDOS demo disc. It really turned out to be prophetic.
Full circle.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think it goes to show how we ended up in the same place, but had a really different path to it. And actually, that shows that back then and to this day, there's really no one way to do it. I'm sure whoever was going to be listening to this might be wondering how they can get in. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this topic many times in this podcast in general. But the main thing is that there's many different ways. I think even if you're just by yourself, nowadays, especially in the last few years, things like Unreal, Unity, GameMaker, all of that can really be done by yourself. You can really do a lot of stuff if you sit down and have that will and time to do something in those engines.
Yeah, there are no rules, so you can basically do whatever will get you there. Whatever, if you're prepared to do whatever it takes. Yeah. You can get a job in this industry.
That's the main thing. If you're ready to spend that time and learn new skills and have something to show, it's going to be there. All right. So that's background about us. Next, I want to talk about the podcast. We're going to have 3 main sections. First, we're going to start with talking about what's happening with us. It can be anything we're playing right now, latest trailers we saw, anything really that's worth talking about that has to do with games. Then we're going to go to industry news. We're going to talk about whatever's happening in the industry, interesting topics. There's always something interesting or controversial happening all the time. I'm sure there's never going to be end of interesting things to talk about, I think. And then the main section will be, like Ian mentioned at the start, we'll play the games off camera, and we're going to be recording our impressions of those playthroughs straight away afterwards. For me personally, it's a way to re-engage with some of the older games. It will be the games I haven't played because that's part of the rules. But also, I'm interested to see what you think of the games that made me want to be a game developer and made impact on me. I expect a lot of them may not have aged well, to be honest. Although it won't be limited to old games. There will be newer games as well. It's not limited to genre or console or PC. All systems are available, all genres. Although I think because we both like RPGs more than most other genres, there'll be a lot of that stuff. But the main requirement is that the suggested game is something that the other person haven't played, and the person that suggests the game has finished it. Unless it's a game from Sega and older, because I played a lot of them but really didn't sit down and kind of beat them. Games were really hard back then. I don't know if you played something like, let's say, Streets of Rage, but that game is hard. If you sit down and no cheats, and it's really hard to beat. It's not impossible, of course.
Funny how Streets of Rage 4 was on my list of...
Right. well, I haven't played that one, so, yeah, so that's the gist of it. We'll keep that rule in general, but we might adjust it as we go. We'll see how it goes, but that's the general rule for the main section of the podcast. So let's talk about the actual games we're going to be playing for the first episode. For Ian, my suggestion was Final Fantasy VIII.
Yes, I've played a lot of the Final Fantasy games, but I actually haven't played 8 yet. I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, this is a chance to remedy that.
Nice.
For Serge, I've recommended for him to play Pharaoh Rebirth.
Yeah, so I have not heard about this game at all. Apparently it's an indie game from about 10 years ago now, I guess.
Yeah, close to it.
Is it like a JRPG inspired? Oh no, you mentioned it's a Metroidvania, was it?
Metroidvania,
right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And you finished it yourself?
Yes, I have.
Nice. Is it a hard game?
No, I don't think it's that challenging.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And I think with that, we can wrap this episode up. Thanks for listening. If you're interested, please listen to the first episode. Thanks, guys.
Take care.